Page 170. Part 13. Everything that the human being is able to achieve, and everything that he or she is not able to achieve, is the outcome of his or her thoughts, and the outcome of the resulting efforts, or of unachieved efforts, which are brought to fruition by means of the might of the thoughts. Once all the manifold details of the universe, which is regulated fairly, are considered, then it can be recognized that a total destruction and annihilation would come about were there a loss of the universal balance. Therefore, this balance must be absolutely fully developed in the form best achievable according to the conditions. Indeed, that is always to be seen as relative according to the present highest possible state of evolution, but everything has its validity in this regard. This applies both to the entire universe as well as to everything which moves, crawls, and flies therein. Especially affected thereby is the human being, who must remain in constant balance in order to be able to actually persist in the fullness of his or her entire life. However, if he or she loses this balance, then the life collapses for him or her, resulting in misery and destruction. For that reason, for the human being, the maintenance of his or her balance means a very great responsibility, which must be individually fulfilled. In particular, consciousness-based balance and the resulting mental and feeling-based balance must be kept in order, because only when these factors agree and are equalized can one's individual responsibility be observed, followed, and fulfilled. The human being, himself or herself, creates his or her strengths and weaknesses, his or her purity and impurity, logic and unlogic, love and hate, his or her right and unright, and everything else conceivable. Everything belongs to him or her alone, and nobody else, because he himself or she herself created and brought about everything by means of the might of his or her thoughts. Therefore, the only human being who is able to alter everything and actually change it is that human being who also brought about the relevant things by means of the might of his or her thoughts. Therefore, things which are created by oneself by means of the might of the thoughts can never be changed by other human beings when it deals with immaterial kinds of factors, such as matters of the feelings and psyche, character and morality, as well as disposition, desire, and mood and personality, and so forth, of the relevant human being who suffers from it, or who can thereby enjoy life. The entire circumstances of life, which are individually related to the psyche as well as to the character, morality, and personality, belong, as a product created by oneself, only to that human being who created them, himself or herself, by means of the might of the thoughts. Never do they belong to another. Joy and sorrow, love and hate, as well as all other things by which the human being is controlled, come solely from his or her own inner nature. The human being forms himself or herself by means of his or her thoughts. Consequently, he or she becomes, and is, just the way he or she thinks. And if he or she changes his or her thinking, then he or she becomes just as he or she thinks in the future, and he or she handles and forms everything from this thinking. A weak human being can never be helped if he or she does not allow himself or herself to be helped, and does not want to recognize and accept the truth of the might of the thoughts. Thus, stronger or even very strong human beings are, in fact, only able to help a weaker human being when this human being grasps the helping hand stretched out to him or her. Yet it is not done with that alone, because, truthfully, the weak one must become strong himself or herself, and pull himself or herself up in order to make a positive step, so that an improvement and strength, which maneuver him or her out of his or her misery, can take hold of him or her. The improvement and strength must be developed as a result of one's own efforts, because it is not possible to simply be given these by others who are strong and healthy, and are admired because of that. The only human being who is able to change his or her circumstances and deplorable states, which relate to his or her physical self and psyche, as well as to his or her character, morality, and personality, is always solely that human being who has created them, himself or herself, by means of the might of the thoughts. Naturally, many moments arise in life in which external influences play a decisive role in the way in which the thoughts, feelings, and psyche, as well as the entire formation of the character, morality, and personality of a human being form. Because this human being allows himself or herself to be influenced in his or her thinking and actions by the particular external circumstances and effects. From that it follows that the one who is influenced by external circumstances is therefore, in this form, also master of his or her own thoughts, and can form and handle them according to that which he himself or she herself wants. Therefore, once a human being allows himself or herself to be bewitched, impressed and persuaded, and so forth, by external influences, then he or she thereby oppresses his or her own will and self-responsibility, and becomes dependent upon the external influences. Consequently, he or she directs his or her thoughts onto them and lets his or her thoughts increasingly spin until they control him or her, and he or she is no longer capable of his or her own creation of thoughts in a positive and equalized sense. Thereby, an oppressor, for example, gains might over a human being who allows himself or herself to be oppressed, just because he or she begins to think and to manage his or her life according to the external influences. In this form, the oppressed one begins to unknowingly cooperate with the oppressor, although both seemingly suffer because of the other. However, the suffering truthfully does not occur because of the other. Rather, it takes the form that the oppressed one, as well as the oppressor, effectively suffer because of themselves. However, this fact is misunderstood and misinterpreted by both sides because there is an absence of the relatively, absolutely, fully developed knowledge which enables the recognition of the truth that the weakness of the oppressed one is just as destructive as the used might of the oppressor. Both the oppressor and the oppressed behave fallibly and against all natural creational laws of balance and of responsibility, which must be individually borne. But this gives no reason for the condemnation of the one or the other, because, truthfully, clarification is appropriate, and is demanded by that creational law which states that no human being should simply leave the other to go on living his or her errors. Rather, each should help every individual live. Thus, the erroneous saying, quote, "live and let live," is in no wise valid. Rather, that which is valid is the word of truth which says, quote, "live and help live." But that means, for both the oppressor as well as for the oppressed, that appropriate feelings for others and the necessary humaneness must be raised, as a consequence of which also necessary instruction, in the form of presenting the truth in regard to all occurring circumstances, has to result, and must be called for, in order to show the truthfully right way. Human beings who overcome their weaknesses and free themselves from, and can rid themselves of, any content of their thoughts which is based on selfishness, imperiousness, egotism, overbearingness, greed, arrogance, haughtiness, and boastfulness, and many other things which are of the same kind or are similar, are soon no longer included among those who are regarded as oppressors or as oppressed ones. They are in fact then free in themselves. And in this state the human being is neither able to debase himself or herself, nor raise himself or herself in an egotistical form above himself or herself or above others. A raising of oneself only occurs in the evolutively appropriate context, in the knowledge of being successful, if the thoughts are neutral, positive, equalized, and react and behave constructively in order to be progressive in their might. But human beings who do not overcome their weaknesses and do not free themselves from the contents of all their negative and destructive thoughts remain weak, wretched, and miserable, because their refusal to raise their thoughts brings increasing inner and outer unfreedom, which finally ends in affliction, illness, and ruin. It is the nature of the thoughts that by means of their might alone, every conceivable thing can be brought to fruition. However, before anything can be achieved and brought to fruition, the thoughts must raise themselves above any extreme immoderateness, and therefore eliminate it in order to make the necessary room for healthy, positive purposefulness. That means, in order to be successful, the human being must renounce his or her selfishness, which, as a rule, degenerates into immoderateness. And once the thoughts are controlled by immoderateness, then neither can a clear thinking nor a methodical planning can come about, resulting in every determination having to therefore fail. Therefore, selfishness and immoderateness must be dissolved and eliminated in order to discover and develop one's latent resources. Only thereby can real, healthy, and positive determinations and endeavors be created and brought to fruition. Only thereby do any kind of undertakings succeed, and only thereby are Ziele achieved and fulfilled. If the human being does not begin to effectively control his or her thoughts, then he or she also never gets into a position of really controlling his or her intentions and affairs. Furthermore, there is then also no opportunity to adopt and actually bear and fulfill the responsibility for oneself and the responsibility for one's life, as well as the responsibility for all external and internal circumstances and for the environment, and so forth. If the human being does not nurture his or her thoughts in a conscious and controlled kind and wise, and if he himself or she herself does not tend in a conscious and controlled form to the bringing about of his or her own setting of Ziele and the fulfillment of them, then he or she is not capable of acting independently and standing effectively on his or her own feet, as well as coping with life itself. In fact, he or she is then constantly dependent on the help of others who are creative and constructive in their thoughts, feelings, and deeds. And since that should not, however, be so, because every single human being of an intelligent and rational kind should live and manage his or her life himself or herself, and therefore also be independent in his or her thoughts, feelings, and actions, and should bear full responsibility for them, it is necessary that the very rudder of one's life is taken in hand and that one's thoughts are formed in a conscious and controlled way. One's thoughts must be free and open, creative, positive, and constructive, and indeed in a form which is conscious, which sets Ziele, and which brings Ziele to fruition. But if that is not done sufficiently, and if low thoughts are consequently maintained, then the leading of one's life is constrained, as is one's innate well-being and one's evolution. The human being's world and life are limited by his or her thoughts, and indeed as a result of their kind and wise, how they are formed and how they are tended and nurtured. As a result of the might inherent in the thoughts, they are brought to realization, and as such, they determine the prosperity and adversity of every individual. Therefore, the life always forms according to the thoughts which are chosen, tended, and nurtured. The way of the progress is generously paved with errors. However, errors are necessary so that one learns from them. This is the path of the evolution. Therefore, without an appropriate quantity of errors, there can be no achievement and no progress. With that, it is also clear that there is no human being who would be without errors in his or her efforts toward the evolution. Even the most knowing human being, with all his or her lived practical experience and his or her ability, must continue to make errors in order to be progressive and to be able to continue to learn. A human being with less knowledge, or even one with no knowledge, must therefore make errors all the more, and take them on all the more if he or she wants to continue his or her education and make sufficient progress. Therefore, errors must not be seen as hindering success and evolution, because only through them do success and progress come about, and indeed as a result of them being recognized, understood in their structure, and resolved. On the one hand, this leads to the expansion of the knowledge and the progress, and on the other hand, to the ability to avoid similar or different errors. Making mistakes therefore brings forth cognition, cognizance, knowledge, practical experience, and living experience, which altogether ultimately form into wisdom, in which ability is also an important factor. Therefore, the fact is that whoever makes no errors also does not learn anything, and cannot become knowing, wise, and able, whereby also the life and learning cannot be mastered to their full extent. The making of errors is a fundamental essence of one's learning and one's progress. Yet it must never be seen such that the exact same errors are permitted to be made over and over again. In fact, it is the case that a specific error should only arise once, to then never be made again, in precisely the same form. Therefore, it is not rightful when a human being neither fathoms nor resolves an error once made, leading to him or her consequently making it in the exact same kind and wise again and again. Truthfully, an error, indeed, exists in thousands of different variations. Consequently, it normally emerges again and again in a different form once it is fathomed and resolved, in the form in which it was made. But that does not mean that the errors should continue to be made unchanged in the same form. So, for example, if an error consists of 1,000 variations, and if it appears in any of these forms, then at least one variation fades away once this part of the mistake is recognized, understood, and its structure and resolved. In its structure and resolved. That also guarantees that the error can no longer appear in the exact same variation, rather only in one of the remaining 999 forms. If the error appears again in this form, then naturally it bears an extraordinary resemblance to the first error, yet it is actually an iota different to that. And again, if this second mistake is also recognized, understood in its structure, and resolved, then 2 of the 1,000 variations are already cleared up and eliminated. Consequently, the next error, of a kind which is related in the same way, is different, in turn, from the 2 preceding ones, and once more a further variation of the error is eliminated when this error is also resolved. Therefore, in this exemplary case, there are 1,000 variations of the error to make, to recognize in their structure, and to resolve, if the entire error is to be resolved. But, since the entire error consists of 1,000 different variations and details, the erroneous impression arises that the same error appears over and over again, which, however, is actually not the case, because with every new error of the same kind, it is not to do with precisely the exact same one, rather with a different variation of the same one. Excluded from evolutive error-making are those errors which are made again and again in exactly the same kind and wise, because the human being does not make the effort to recognize them, to understand them in their structure, and also to resolve them. Such errors can be very manifold and exist in forms which are conditioned by the thoughts and feelings, and thereby also by the psyche. But they can also be errors to do with entrenched habits, or errors which are based on imperiousness, egoism, irresponsibility, overbearingness, egocentricity, religious belief, or some sort of fanaticism, and so forth. Errors which are not evolutive and appear again and again in unchanged form not only have a constrictive effect on the entire world of the consciousness and world of thoughts, rather also an inhibiting effect concerning one's evolution and the formation of one's character, morality, and essential personality, quite aside from the fact that they also exert extremely negative influences on the human being's social behavior, as well as on effectively being human, on interpersonal relationships, on uprightness, on the bearing and fulfilling of responsibility, and on very many other weighty things which make up the actual life and fundamentally belong to it. Without an appropriate quantity of error-making, there can therefore be no progress and no achievement. But the recognition and resolution of immoderateness and selfishness, and various other things of a negative-bad type, is connected with making errors and the resolution of errors. The result of that is that every success, whether it has a worldly nature or personality-related nature, grows in proportion to the degree to which selfish, egocentric, imperious, egotistical, overbearing, and arrogant, as well as excessive and other habits, qualities, fads, and characteristics, and so forth, are overcome. Thereby, the powers of the consciousness, and therefore the thoughts, must be concentrated on the development of the grasped zeal, setting, and plans, and one's power of decision and self-confidence must be strengthened. The higher the human being raises his or her positive, healthy, good, creative, and constructive thoughts, and tends and nurtures them in an equalized form, the more successful, upright, progressive, and righteous he or she becomes. Thereby, the good, positive, and idealistic values and endeavors which are worth bringing to fruition also increase, from which finally success is also achieved, as well as lasting accomplishments. The human being, himself or herself, advantages or disadvantages himself or herself in every form when factors which arise from the might of his or her thoughts are concerned. And exactly this has nothing to do with unhonest, unjust human beings being able to acquire material might and wealth, and so forth, for themselves. Truthfully, in spite of their might and their material wealth, such human beings are poor and are the losers throughout the line of their evolution. They are actually, namely, devoid of all those values which constitute the quality of being human, and which determine the real inner happiness as well as the true love and the inner freedom and the equalized harmony. But they are also devoid of the consciousness-based and spiritual progress, and indeed in the measure in which these are neglected and disregarded. Therefore, human beings of this kind are truthfully poor and are the actual losers in life, because the universe, that is to say, the universal consciousness and its creational laws, never favors greed, hate, unhonesty, lust for might and revenge, licentiousness, exploitation, thievery and cheating, addiction, villainy and laziness, and so forth, even when this may appear otherwise from time to time, when superficially viewed. The fact is that the creational natural laws and recommendations give their help in rightness to those who are magnanimous, virtuous, studious, honest, and fair, because they alone evolve in conscious form according to their pre-existing striving and effective sense of life, while the others, the fallible ones in the matters of evolution and the resulting fulfillment of obligation and observation of responsibility, fail and fall prey to pure material values which bring no success in the form of consciousness-based and spiritual progress. And although it may appear otherwise from time to time on the bare surface, that indeed corresponds to nothing more than appearances and deception. This truth can be presented and taught in different kind and wise, yet at its core it is unalterable. Therefore it can also be recognized, proven, and followed in various ways, yet every way thereby requires that one works at it incessantly to become more virtuous and discerning of the truth and to become a true human being. But being a human being does not only mean allowing humaneness to prevail, rather that all creational natural laws and recommendations are followed and lived, which also means that the creation conditioned striving for evolution must be fulfilled. But the fulfillment can only be achieved by means of one's thoughts, the might of which is able to bring everything to fruition when the human being deliberately makes the effort for that. Intellectual achievements and successes are also the result of the might of the thoughts. And everything beautiful and true in life, as well as all cognitions, all knowledge, and all wisdom, lead back to thoughts. Even the formation of the nature and the world, quite simply, leads back solely to the might of the human being's thoughts, because every form of formation is based on one previous thought or an entire series of previous thoughts. Certainly, many such formations and achievements are sometimes based on ambition and vanity, but they are nevertheless not the product of these qualities. Rather, they are the result of correct, positive, clear, constructive, and creative thinking. Such achievements therefore emerge from a natural series of long and laborious efforts pertaining to the consciousness thoughts, and from pure, clear, selfless, constructive, and progressive thoughts, as they should be correctly maintained by every human being. Consciousness-based achievements, which concern factors related to character, morality, and personality, and consciousness-based works, such as poetry, music, painting, and fiction, and so forth, are the fulfillment of controlled and conscious, as well as zeal-setting efforts, which are established and brought to fruition by means of thoughts. But such bringing to fruition can only succeed when there is an existing selflessness, and with that, the understanding that the endeavors are not realized from the viewpoint of a reason which one must appraise as personal and egotistical, rather for the sake of the matter itself. Therefore, if a human being lives constantly with pure, noble, and exalted thoughts in mind, which only ever linger with that which is pure, positive, healthy, and selfless, then he or she also builds in himself or herself a pure, noble, healthy, and positive character, a corresponding morality and disposition and personality, and indeed he or she does this as certainly as the sun reaches its zenith. Whatever the human being strives for and completes is always based upon mental efforts. The bringing to fruition of the efforts and endeavors is the crown of the thoughts, and this testifies to the character of the thoughts. If these are directed at zeal and are embedded in a conscious striving for bringing things to fruition and are embedded in a decidedness, self-control, and righteousness, then the self-worth of the human being increases, just as do all values of the factors conditioned by evolution. But as a result of laziness, an absence of self-control, an absence of decidedness, unproductive and confused thinking, and as a result of an absence of interest and neglect of responsibility, the human being falls down into the abyss of depravity, misery, affliction, and all other terrible things. The human being is able to raise himself or herself to a high level of success, not only in himself or herself, rather also in his or her external surroundings, and out in the wide world. In the consciousness-based realm, he or she can even climb to elevated heights when he or she lives rightfully and follows the laws and recommendations of the evolution. Nevertheless, however, he or she is able to very quickly plunge into severe weaknesses and wretchedness if he or she allows arrogant, selfish, and corrupt thoughts to grasp possession of him or her and come to fruition by means of their might. Therefore, constant and uninterrupted attentiveness and control is necessary so that the product of weak, bad, and negative thoughts cannot arise and gain the upper hand. Victories can therefore only be attained and retained when they are given the required watchfulness. But if that is neglected, even when success appears to be so certain, then everything very quickly falls prey to negation and failure. Everything that the human being is ever able to achieve, regardless of whether it is in some sort of material-intellectual or purely coarse-material kind, such as in the form of businesses or some sort of works and products, and so forth, or in values which pertain purely to the consciousness, character, morality, attitude, and personality, is solely the result of clear, pure, positive, healthy, and zeal-directed thoughts and their might, by means of which they are brought to fruition. But the laws which are innate in this truth also apply to that which is purely negative and bad, when, namely, the thoughts are correspondingly formed and steered. The same laws which, through their governance, lead the positive, pure, and healthy thoughts, also steer those which are unpure, wrong, bad, unhealthy, and negative. Consequently, in this regard, the method is therefore the same. The difference lies solely in the form of the thoughts and in their zeal. Whoever wants to achieve much must also take much on board in terms of efforts, errors, and arduousness, in contrast to those who want to achieve little because they are shy of efforts, errors, and arduousness. Whoever wants to achieve that which is high must take even more efforts, errors, and arduousness upon himself or herself. And whoever strives for the very highest must take upon himself or herself the greatest arduousness as well as the most errors and efforts. The more one wants to achieve, the more there are demands of all kinds which one must deal with. For that reason, only the human being who maintains his or her thoughts in healthy, righteous, striving-based, positive, and conscious form, and makes the necessary setting of zeal in order to bring them to fruition, is able to achieve that which is great, that which is higher, and that which is the highest.